This story goes back to the summer of 2019. Back then, I was in my early 20s, spending my summers working as a camp counselor. When I was younger, I got into a lot of trouble, and a big reason for that was not having any positive role models growing up. So being able to spend my summers out in nature and be a positive role model for kids was such a rewarding experience. It genuinely helped me turn my own life around. However, not every experience was a pleasant one. This specific story happened at a camp where I had already been working for 5 years. Now, the layout of this summer camp wasn't like the typical bunkhouse situation you see in the movies. Instead of one massive barracks-style room, the cabins were set up a lot like a house. You would walk through the front door and enter a big common area, equipped with a TV, a wraparound couch, and a small kitchenette. From the common room, a hallway led to 3 separate bedrooms, with 4 beds in each room. That meant I was personally responsible for 12 campers. My own room was situated right on the other side of the common area. This living situation was specifically designed to give teens a taste of what dorm life would be like when they went away to college in a few years. One morning, one of my campers came up to me and said he kept hearing someone walking around all night, and it was keeping him awake. I brushed it off at first, telling him it was probably just a couple of kids pulling a late-night prank. That night, right before lights out, while everyone was hanging out in the common room, I made a strict announcement. I reminded all 12 campers that once lights out hit, everyone was required to stay in bed unless they genuinely needed to use the bathroom. Most of them gave me those blank, oblivious teenage looks, but they all nodded in agreement. Right around 1 a.m., I was startled awake by several of my campers screaming at the top of their lungs. I bolted out of bed and sprinted straight to their room. When I flipped on the light switch, the 4 teenagers inside looked like they had literally seen a ghost. One of them was even in tears. When I demanded to know what happened, the kid who had talked to me earlier about the footsteps finally spoke up, pointing a trembling finger toward the closet doorway. He explained that he had seen a dark figure standing right by the closet. At first, he thought he was losing his mind, so he tried to ignore it and force himself back to sleep, but he couldn't. He said he could hear the sound of heavy breathing coming from the shadow. It was too dark in the room to make out specific facial features. It just looked like a dense, solid mass blocking the closet doorway. Instead of freaking out completely, he woke up his roommates. They saw the figure too, but they had no idea what it was. Apparently, the kid who was now in tears had convinced himself that it was just another camper from a different dorm playing a sick joke. He decided to get out of bed and march right up to the shadowy figure. But the second he got close, the figure bolted out of the room and slammed the door shut behind it. That sudden, violent slam is what sent them all into a panic and made them scream. When I asked the camper who approached it if he got a good look, he said no, but whatever or whoever it was tall, really tall. That was the exact moment he knew for sure it wasn't one of the other kids. Still, I wasn't entirely convinced. A random shadowy figure standing in a kid's room just didn't compute for me. I told them to stay put while I searched the house to make sure no one was hiding. Due to all the commotion, the kids in the other 2 rooms were wide awake now, asking what was going on, but I told them to stay in their respective rooms. I honestly believed it was just another camper trying to be funny. I searched the entire house from top to bottom, and I didn't see a single person. There wasn't even any evidence of a break-in. The front door was still securely locked, and there weren't any muddy footprints or grass tracked in from outside. It took a while, but I eventually got the campers to calm down and relax. Deciding to stay awake, I grabbed a book and sat out in the common room. Not only was I wide awake now, but I also wanted to see if this little prankster would resurface. After a while, I started to doze off. I wasn't fully asleep yet when I heard it, the distinct sound of wood creaking coming from down the hallway.
I froze completely, holding my breath to make sure my ears weren't playing tricks on me. There was no doubt about it. Footsteps. I got up from the couch and slowly made my way toward the hallway. I deliberately didn't turn on any lights because, remember, I still thought this was just an annoying camper trying to pull a prank, and I wanted to catch them red-handed. I expected to see a teenager standing there looking like a deer caught in the headlights. That is not what I got. When I looked down that dimly lit hallway, standing right in front of an open window was a towering figure. I couldn't make out any fine details, but it was there, a massive dark silhouette, clearly human. Its hand was resting right on the doorknob of the exact same room where the kids had been terrorized earlier. I didn't scream. I didn't want to wake the campers or terrify them further. The figure slowly let go of the doorknob and turned to face me. I have never been so terrified in my entire life. I couldn't even see this thing's eyes, but just knowing it was staring directly back at me made my legs turn straight to jello. Now that it was facing me, the figure was even taller than I originally thought. Its head was almost scraping the top of the doorframe. This was unequivocally not a teenager. Just the eerie, unnatural way it moved gave it away. I braced myself, expecting the figure to charge right at me, but it didn't. It stood there at the end of the hallway for what felt like an uncomfortably long eternity. I could actually hear its heavy, raspy breathing echoing in the quiet night air. Then, with a strangely erratic, jerky movement, it simply stepped backward out of the open window and vanished completely into the darkness. I immediately called the man in charge of the camp and told him to call the police, which he did. Some of the off-duty staff searched the surrounding woods, but they found no trace of anyone. When the police arrived, I told them everything, but because my description was so vague, essentially just a tall shadow, there wasn't much they could do. Looking back, seeing that figure completely messed me up. I can't even imagine how those poor kids felt. The absolute worst part of the whole ordeal is the not knowing. We never got any answers. I have no clue where that shadowy figure came from, what it wanted, or, most disturbing of all, why it was only targeting that one specific room. It's that unanswered question that has kept me up at night for the rest of my life.
The next story.
When I was in high school, my parents forced me to attend this stupid, overly strict religious summer camp. I hated the outdoors, and I definitely wasn't a summer camp person. I preferred spending my time indoors, playing video games or hanging out with my friends in the neighborhood. Looking back, I guess that was the exact reason my parents made me go. It was a desperate effort to get me out into the fresh air and hopefully make some new friends. Instead, I left that summer camp with a terrifying experience I will never, ever forget. Something supernatural, something that to this day I still cannot logically explain. I spent the first few days getting acquainted with my bunkmates and getting a lay of the land. Surprisingly, it wasn't terrible. I was starting to enjoy myself a little bit. Being a 15-year-old boy, I also loved the fact that this particular camp was co-ed. I immediately started going out of my way to try and impress the girls, especially one girl in particular, Jenny Messina. I had developed a massive crush on her, and pretty soon I was basing my entire daily camp schedule around whatever Jenny was doing. Jenny was the superstitious type. Her absolute favorite part of camp life was sitting around the campfire at night, listening to scary ghost stories, something I honestly wouldn't have expected to be allowed at a religious summer camp. One night, as we were all huddled around the flickering campfire, one of our camp counselors decided to tell us a local legend.
He told us that there was a small cabin located just a short walk away from all the other cabins that was completely abandoned. According to the counselor, some horrific, unspeakable accident happened inside that cabin decades ago, and ever since then it had been left empty and rotting. He didn't go into specific details about what actually happened, but his tone implied that it was gruesome, and he specifically used the word evil. Then he went on to list every classic ghost story trope in the book, the kind of stuff people always say when they want to make an old building sound haunted. He told us people had claimed to see strange figures wandering past the windows at night, or heard unexplainable noises echoing from within. And then, as a chilling kicker, he claimed that one camper who went inside was never seen again.
Right after dropping that bombshell, the counselor let out a sudden, blood-curdling scream in an attempt to scare us. And honestly, it worked like a charm on about 50% of the kids listening. Everyone panicked and scattered, except for Jenny. Jenny stayed right by the fire and asked the counselor point blank if a camper actually vanished and was never seen again. The counselor just laughed it off, telling us it was purely an urban legend, just a scary story they told the older kids to keep us on our toes. He insisted he didn't believe it was actually haunted. We all sat around talking about it for a while longer. We assumed the camp directors purposely left that cabin empty just to give the legend some weight, to make it feel authentic. Having an abandoned building sitting out in the woods for no apparent reason gave the ghost story a strange sense of validation. At least, that's what some of us, especially Jenny, liked to believe. Eventually, the counselor gathered us all up and ordered us to head back to our respective rooms for the night. But what he didn't know was that a small group of us had already hatched a secret plan to sneak back out later that night to play Truth or Dare. And yes, Jenny was one of the people in on the plan. We waited a few hours, making sure all the camp counselors had finally turned in for the night before we quietly slipped out of our cabins. We agreed to meet down by the water, which was about a 10-minute walk from the main cabin area. We wanted to make sure we were far enough away so that no one would wake up and hear us. There were 8 of us who ended up sneaking out. The 5 guys got down to the lake first, and the 3 girls showed up a few minutes later. We sat around in the dark for a little while longer, whispering and giggling, before we finally started playing Truth or Dare. I saw it as the ultimate golden opportunity to show off and impress Jenny. At first, everyone was too chicken to pick a dare, sticking strictly to the safety of truth. But when it finally rolled around to my turn, someone dared me to go inside the abandoned cabin and stay in there completely alone for 10 full minutes. I could see that Jenny looked genuinely terrified, but honestly, I didn't care about the haunted cabin myth. I didn't believe in ghosts. The only thing I was nervous about was getting caught breaking camp rules. Breaking 2 rules, sneaking out of my cabin and breaking into a restricted building, felt way scarier than some made-up campfire ghost story. We all quietly crept up to the edge of the abandoned cabin. There was this heavy, suffocating uneasiness hanging in the air. I think everyone was secretly thinking about the counselor's story, letting even a shred of doubt creep into their minds. But for me, the unease was purely adrenaline from trespassing. I walked right up to the front door and glanced back over my shoulder. All of my friends were standing back near the tree line, watching me with wide eyes. To my surprise, when I jiggled the handle, the door wasn't locked. I didn't have to force it open or break a window. It swung open smoothly, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut behind me.
It was pitch black inside, save for faint slivers of moonlight cutting through the grimy windows. The air inside smelled old, stagnant, and heavily musty, like a place that hadn't seen a human presence in decades. It also felt unnaturally cold, a sharp chill that cut right through my clothes. I started pacing back and forth inside the empty room, trying to keep track of the time. Suddenly, I heard the sound of wood creaking loudly from behind me. It sounded exactly like footsteps. I whipped around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the room was completely empty. I tried to convince myself that the ancient wooden floorboards were just suffering from a delayed reaction to my own footsteps. I know that made zero scientific sense, but that's how my panicked teenage brain tried to rationalize it. I pulled out my watch and checked the time, completely bewildered to find that only 2 minutes had passed. It felt like I had already been trapped in that suffocating darkness for 20 minutes. In the center of the cabin stood a thick structural wooden beam. Deciding I needed to anchor myself, I walked over and leaned against it. Creak, creak. There it was again, that wretched creaking sound. I scanned every dark corner of the cabin, but there was still nobody there. Then the sound escalated. It got louder, sharper, and much faster, almost like someone was actively running across the rotting wooden floorboards right toward me. Yet when I looked, nothing was there, and just as suddenly as it started, it stopped dead. I checked my watch again. Only 1 more minute had passed, 3 minutes total. Panic was starting to choke me. I walked over to one of the dusty windows and looked outside, hoping desperately to spot my friends standing by the trees, but I couldn't see them. I pressed my hands flat against the glass, straining my eyes, but the spot where they were supposed to be was completely empty. I started softly tapping on the glass window, trying to signal them, but absolutely no one appeared. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was terrified. The ghost story and my friends' fearful reactions had finally gotten under my skin. I decided I'd had enough. I was done trying to be brave. I was walking out, even if my friends laughed at me for cracking under pressure. I turned around and marched straight to the front door. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted it. It wouldn't budge. I yanked on it harder, throwing my weight against it. The door was completely stuck. I looked down at the knob, panicking, thinking I might have accidentally locked it when I walked in. But there was no lock on the interior side of the door. It wasn't locked. It was jammed shut by something immense. I started slamming my shoulder against the wood, yelling at the top of my lungs. And right as I did that, the noises inside the cabin exploded around me. The footsteps returned, echoing loudly from every single direction at once. It sounded unnatural, mocking, and deeply malicious. I swear to God I could feel an evil, suffocating presence standing right behind my back. I wanted to turn around, but my body was completely paralyzed by fear. I pounded furiously on the wood, screaming for help. Suddenly, I heard someone on the other side of the door desperately trying to force it open. It was Jenny. Even though I thought they had left me, she had stayed behind. I heard her voice shouting through the wood, telling me the door was jammed from the outside and they were trying everything to break it open. While I was pressed against the door, I felt an ice-cold gust of air hit my neck. I felt a deliberate, raspy breath brush right against my shoulder. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew something was towering right behind me. I let go of the knob, lost my footing, and collapsed backward onto the floor, burying my head in my arms. And then, with a sudden violent crack, the door flew open and I tumbled out into the night air. Standing right in front of me were 2 camp counselors with grim, furious expressions. But at that exact moment, I had never felt such overwhelming, pure relief in my life.
I scrambled out of the cabin, collapsing onto the dirt outside, thanking them over and over for getting me out. They did not look pleased. They hauled me up and marched me straight to the main administration cabin. I spent the rest of that night locked in what was essentially summer camp solitary confinement. The next morning, I was summoned to a meeting with the camp director. I sat across from her and poured my heart out, telling her everything about the creepy footsteps, the locked door, and the malicious presence inside. She just rolled her eyes, completely dismissive. She told me that the counselors had strict instructions not to tell that stupid campfire story because it gave impressionable kids nightmares. She assured me the legend was completely fake, designed solely to scare campers, and she didn't care about my overactive imagination. Instead, she called my parents. I was officially expelled from summer camp on the spot for breaking curfew, sneaking out, and trespassing in a restricted hazard zone. Honestly, I didn't even care. I was so profoundly traumatized by what happened in that cabin that I was just happy to be going home, even if I knew I'd be grounded for the rest of the summer. Back then, I tried looking into the history of the camp and the cabin on the limited internet we had, but I couldn't find a single reliable detail. The camp has since permanently shut down, and every few years over the data-filled decades, I've tried searching for it online again, but nothing ever comes up. It's easy for skeptics to say it was all just a teenage hallucination brought on by a scary story, but I know it wasn't. I don't scare easily, and that was the only time in my entire life I have ever felt true, unadulterated primal terror. I've heard old wooden floors creak thousands of times since then, and none of them have ever moved with that kind of deliberate, methodical malice. Sometimes I think about driving up to that abandoned site just to see if the cabin is still standing. If I ever do, maybe I'll step back inside and give that 10-minute challenge another shot. Who knows? Maybe this time I'd actually last the full 10 minutes.